I've made a couple of videos before that sort of touch on our topic for today. They're certainly not a prerequisite for watching this video, but I wanted to mention that this is not a new problem that I have for RWBY. It's just that Volume 7 has been the most noticeable example of this building problem. Team RWBY are no longer the protagonists of the show RWBY. Allow me to explain. Protagonist. The leading character, or one of the major characters in a drama, movie, novel, or other fictional text. A protagonist is the main character of a story. The protagonist is at the center of the story, makes the key decisions, and experiences the consequences of those decisions. The protagonist is the primary agent propelling the story forward, and is often the character who faces the most significant obstacles. Now, RWBY has an ensemble cast. It's very large, and most of the characters are presented as important to the story. This is not inherently a negative. Other works with ensemble casts include Fullmetal Alchemist and Land of the Lustrous. Having many characters in play is fine for a story, but there should still be a clear protagonist. And not every show has only one protagonist. This is also fine. Playing the starring role could apply to a whole team, but that's the problem with RWBY. There is no clear protagonist. We are told it's supposed to be Team RWBY to an extent, but with Ruby Rose as the main protagonist. The show is named after the team, they were the focus of the first 4 trailers, supplemental works constantly feature them, they were the first characters to be introduced to the audience in the show. Team RWBY should be our focus. They should be making the big decisions for the plot and growing the most throughout the story. They should be the ones making the show keep moving forward. They aren't. Let's go over how Team RWBY are not filling the role of protagonist successfully. First, they are not the center of the story. RWBY is constantly jumping away from our title team to focus on the rest of the cast. While it's not bad to flesh out the supporting members, Team RWBY never gets that fleshing out. Jean struggles with the loss of Pyrrha, Ren and Nora have relationship issues, Crow's bad luck and working on making friends, Winter hates her family, Penny's struggling to deal with hate and working through emotions, Ironwood's making plans but having problems with anxiety, Cinder wants power and is willing to tell the camera that as many times as she needs. When does RWBY get to play? And this is by all means nothing new. Side characters have been stealing screen time from our title heroes since the earliest volumes, but that doesn't make it okay. Everyone else in the cast gets ample screen time to develop and explore their relationships, but our protagonists don't. Any screen time offered to Team RWBY is dedicated to dumping lore onto the audience, fleshing out a different character, or pushing the plot forward. Which creates this weird dichotomy where Ranger are fleshed out, interesting characters with developing relationships and who are growing with each volume, but they do nothing to affect the main plot, while RWBY are one-dimensional archetypes that hardly interact who force themselves to be involved with the main story. Which leads me to the next point. Team RWBY aren't growing at all. Yang loses an arm but doesn't change from it. She gets moody for a while but doesn't learn anything new or develop her fighting style or alter the way she sees the world or affect how she interacts with people. She just gets a new arm. There's the idea of growth as she gets grouchy for a couple of years, but it goes nowhere, and let's also make it clear, a character's mood being different isn't the same as growth. It could lead to growth, as Yang grows to understand her new perspective on the world, but instead it's just her being zero fun until she gets a girlfriend and then magically becomes all better. Which is another thing. Simply giving your character a new relationship also is not the same as development. Tai tells Yang not to use her semblance so recklessly, which only translates into Yang using it way less. Again, we don't see her develop around this idea, she doesn't struggle to learn anything, she just starts fighting way more boringly. It's the same with Weiss, she doesn't have to change to escape her dad's mansion, Klein just gets her out once the finale starts. She does learn how to summon, but just giving your character a new ability is also not the same as development. In the first scene, we see Weiss starting to learn how to control this ability. She masters it. There was no struggle, no growth, she just can summon now. And even worse is when they retcon out their own development. Blake lands at Menagerie where she waffles back and forth between being a sassy bitch and crying. A gang attacks her family, she helps Ilya switch to the good guy side, and now Blake's confident. She has friends by her side, and with their support she goes to Haven to confront her abusive ex-boyfriend. She punches him real good and has multiple one-liners against him. Her friends and family have helped her learn to be strong and to stand up for herself. By all means, Blake has conquered her running away arc and actually gets to develop. But then Volume 6 just pretends none of that happened. She sees Adam and suddenly all that confidence she gained is stripped away to make her a sad, scared princess to be saved by her new love interest. She regresses as a character and her development is thrown away to make Yang the strong one who fends off the meanie villain that Blake is no longer allowed to be able to defend herself against. And RWBY's the worst because she doesn't even get to pretend to develop. Ren has a whole tragic backstory adventure and RWBY just stood near him. RWBY goes to Haven under the guise of learning about Cinder and then just sits around the house while Ozpin exposits at the kids. Maria tells her how to use her eyes and RWBY does nothing about it. She only ever tries using her eyes when it's super dangerous times. Never mind taking the time to train that ability during your cutesy montage. We all know the script will just make her eyes go whenever it needs them to anyway. She never grows. Shit just happens to her and she never needs to change for it. And before you leave your comment, yes, I am aware that there is something called a flat character arc, wherein basically the protagonist doesn't change over the course of the story, but rather is a pillar of consistency prompting others around them to change. RWBY is clearly not going through a flat character arc. 1, she's grown and developed before Volume 4, it'd be outrageous to change the type of arc a character's going through suddenly like that. And 2, RWBY's not doing shit to help others develop either. She doesn't talk to any of her friends, she isn't referenced as an example others wish to follow, she barely even knows what's going on half the time. She's just also there, near the plot. For being presented as our main protagonist, RWBY isn't even much of a character by this point. Any arc given to the team results in simply stripping the girls of any interesting characteristics they had to make them all blandly safe and nice. They're all the same character with a slightly different palette. Stick any of them in a conversation and they give the same responses as each other, just using different words. Any growth the RWBY girls get is either a new love interest or a new move to use. Their development is on par with level grinding in Pokemon. Furthermore, Team RWBY are incidental to the plot. They aren't making key decisions about it or experiencing consequences for those decisions. They aren't propelling the story forward, the story is reluctantly dragging them along. The show constantly has the villains being active in continuing the plot, while all 15 of the heroes just wait for the bad guys to attack. Since Volume 4, the girls have been doing little else than following Crow or Ozpin's orders. They never do anything to get to the final battle of the volume, and often don't do anything more than sit and wait for instructions. RWBY has no agency in their actions, and Volume 7 is the worst example of this. Why did they go to Atlas in the first place? Was it because they thought Ironwood would help keep the lamp safe? Because they don't do that? They get to Atlas and pretend to not trust Ironwood, just to totally trust him immediately, but then they still don't do anything with the lamp. It just stays with Oscar until the finale where it gets taken. Didn't Team RWBY want to come here to hide the lamp? Why don't they work on that? Instead, the main plot, the reason they landed in Atlas in the first place, is immediately forgotten and the girls just get jobs as huntresses. And then they just do their job. The main story is totally ignored despite it constantly glowing on Oscar's hip, to instead have the team busy themselves with petty Atlas politics. And that was an exciting subplot to watch develop, but whoever gets a seat on the council has nothing to do with Salem taking over the world or whatever. It doesn't matter if Jacques had won or if Robin had won, Watts still would have turned off the heat. Half the volume is dedicated to a throwaway story, and Team RWBY barely even interact with that. Weiss is shown to be thinking about the Atlas politics a lot, but then she doesn't even get to solve the mystery. Without any prompting from Weiss, Willow just tells her everything she needs to know to arrest Jacques. Again, our hero doesn't have to try to get the results they're looking for, she just has to wait for the script to hand it to her on a silver platter. And Weiss got to do the most for this subplot! Blake and Yang don't give a single shit about any of this politics stuff. The two just stay in the background and go to parties, and RWBY just stands around and watches whatever Penny does. Then once the useless politics plot finishes, we jump straight into the villains are attacking, and from there it's all the same as before. Team RWBY fights off the baddies with no effort or growth to be had. Nothing Team RWBY does prompts Watts to turn off the heat. Team RWBY being in the area had no effect on Tyrion's slaughter. Cinder and Neo never even encounter Team RWBY beyond another 1 second long Deus Ex Machina. Team RWBY did nothing to get Salem to show up on the whale. So I have to sit here and watch how little our protagonists are affecting the plot, and I start to wonder, why are we wasting so much time on Team RWBY? They are not the main characters of the story. Penny, Nora, and Ironwood are. Nora is the team member who engages in the politics plot the most. She's constantly at odds with Ironwood and Ren about it. Every chance she gets, she's arguing for the case of Robin and Mantle, while Ruby and the others just quietly sit in the background and watch. And yet, despite all these moments of Nora clearly having a strong opinion about the plot and the willingness to take action about it, she never gets to do anything for it. She yells and kisses Ren, and then she just stops getting to do anything important. Despite being the only one of the kids who's actually invested in the relationship between Atlas and Mantle, Nora gets relocated to bad comic relief and then just has to stand around and watch Ironwood and Robin resolve their issues without her input. Because since we have to pretend Team RWBY are the protagonists, they have to be the ones to push the plot forward. So instead of letting Nora act upon all this yelling she does in the first half of the volume, we have to make Blake and Yang do it instead. Blake and Yang never engage in this plot to the point they don't even get to be privy to most of Nora's debates with Ironwood. They're so wholly uninvolved that their truck scene feels out of character. Suddenly the two feel so strongly about how this isn't right that they decide to go against the orders given to them while on the job to help a criminal they've never met and have never been shown to care about. They're willing to betray their team for her, to betray the man who gave Yang her new arm. Anyone could have told Robin what Ironwood was planning, so why make it Blake and Yang? Was it just because they don't get to do anything else all volume? Because by all means, Blake and Yang simply stole a scene that Nora should have gotten. Rather than have Bumblebee sit in a truck and suddenly decide they have to betray their orders and try and reach out to help Robin, it should have been Nora, the one person on the hero team already shown to be on Robin's side. She could be paired with Blake and use Atlas's mistreatment of Faunus as a way to convince Blake to help her. This would tie into the Atlas is racist shtick we've seen constantly thrown at us, and it would keep Team RWBY involved while also staying accurate to pre-established character motivation. We know Blake cares a lot about how Faunus are treated and wants to make it better, and we know Nora thinks Robin is the only one actually trying to help Mantle. I know it's hard for Rooster Teeth to remember that couples don't need to do everything together, but removing Yang and replacing her with the more active member of the group in relation to the plot would be a wholesale improvement. Team RWBY steals the screen time not only to the detriment of Nora's development, but also to the detriment of the story. Blake and Yang's out-of-nowhere decision to side with Robin just makes the later reveal with Ironwood feel contrived. He doesn't trust Team RWBY because Blake and Yang suddenly decide to help the criminal they never cared about. But if Ironwood's mistrust of the heroes had been the culmination of all the arguing he'd done with Nora, coming to a head with her betraying Ironwood to give Robin information about his plan, that would make sense. Penny is one of the most important elements of the volume, and yet feels so disconnected and disjointed from her own story. Things keep happening to Penny, and she keeps reacting and taking action towards them, but her actions never seem to matter. Penny's alive again! No reaction from the cast. Penny's framed for murder! That doesn't go anywhere. Penny's struggling with personal feelings! She doesn't get a choice about it. She has to become the Maiden, despite that not being Ironwood's plan. We never get to see how these big changes to Penny actually affect her. Penny isn't allowed the screen time to let her character be allowed to grow around the events of the story. RWBY spends a fair amount of time talking to Penny, but they never stray outside of the same Penny's learning how the world works and how people behave shtick. While these interactions are cute, we don't really need these. We already know Penny's not a real girl, but is doing her best to understand her thoughts and feelings. So why not instead allow Penny and RWBY's conversations to let us explore how these big events that keep happening to Penny impacts her character and development. Because without that, the finale of the volume feels a little weightless. I do care about our heroes winning and found the events around Freya and Cinder to be engaging, but the scenario could have been much more satisfying by seeing how the events of the volume had prompted Penny to grow. It could have all hit much harder if we had gotten to see how Penny changed from all the difficult positions she'd been in, to let her be influenced by the people who hurt her and her friends, to allow her the opportunity to choose to become the Maiden instead of giving her no alternative. Instead of wasting so much time on Team RWBY not doing anything, I wish we had gotten to see Penny actually get to develop instead. Ironwood gets the most growth and development of the volume. He's constantly making tough decisions, seeking advice, and taking action to stand up for what he believes in. But he's also relegated to minuscule moments of screen time squished between all the time wasters of the volume. Ironwood isn't running for a seat on the council. He isn't participating in that subplot except in relation to Penny. Penny getting framed for the murders makes a significantly bigger impact on Ironwood than it does on Penny. He still trusts and employs Penny, but her getting framed impedes his mission to get the tower up again. For the most part, everything James does is in relation to the tower, and at first that makes Ironwood feel really limited. He's not engaging with the politics or characters, but we get to see him constantly be at odds with finishing his goal. He just wants to get the tower up, but we also get to see him struggle with his fears over Cinder. He wants to reconnect the world, but is afraid he'll lose again, that Cinder and Salem will render his soldiers moot again, that he's weak. Because of this dichotomy, Ironwood's scenes carry a weight that Team RWBY's all lack. His scenes matter. Ironwood has depth. He's one of the most layered characters the show's had. He's able to give Oscar and the audience important lore. He's powerful enough in the story that his decisions matter and affect the world around him. And yet, he's also selfish, clearly wanting Ozpin back to help him. He's so nice and spends so much time with Oscar because he's trying to force the person he actually wants to see back into the forefront. Even though he's not involved with the council plot, Ironwood stays rooted in the main plot, which means whenever we cut to him, it's for something important. He's regularly pushing the narrative forward with things like giving the kids their licenses, deciding whether or not to help Mantle, and issuing martial law. And when he's not driving the plot forward, we're watching him develop. We get to see Ironwood give in to his fears, watch him change his morals. At the start of the volume, James was strong and confident, unshakable and powerful with a plan already in action and all the resources he needed to make it work. But by the end, he's bitter, angry. His lofty plan to protect his people shifts to a defense mechanism, running away and hiding from the bad guys by flying Atlas away, all while still letting himself believe he's doing the right thing. James grows so much over the course of the volume that he actively shifts out of hero status to willing to shoot a kid to get what he wants, and that growth was clear throughout. There's never a moment where suddenly Ironwood starts behaving way different out of nowhere. Every time we were stuck watching Team RWBY waffle around some backstory, I just wanted to go back to Ironwood. I cared about his actions, his decisions, and his dilemmas. He was the driving force for the narrative of Volume 7. He is the reason plot elements happen. He reacts directly to the villain's challenges. Ironwood should have been our focus for the volume. For some reason, there's this insistence from RT that Team RWBY should be the ones we care about, but then in the show, the girls are never given a reason for us to care about them. Nora involves herself with the plot, Penny is constantly missing out on opportunities to grow, Ironwood drives the narrative forward. All three of these characters outweigh our protagonists so much that they all actually get to fight members of the evil organization during the finale, while Team RWBY has to fight jobbers. The Aesop's fight is the least engaging or entertaining fight of the finale, and it's the one Team RWBY are stuck with. The girls matter so little to the plot that they have to waste a whole episode in a hollow fight against a group of not villains with no setup. I mean, the fight's pretty, but there's no tension. The girls show no sign of struggling during the encounter, and they're still stuck fighting one-off, unimportant characters. Meanwhile, the real villains, partaking in the real plot, are busy not even caring that Team RWBY are in the building. There's no relationship between RWBY and the bad guys, and by all means, the writers aren't doing anything to try and rectify that. Cinder constantly talks about how much she hates RWBY and how she wants to be a meanie to her, but we've literally never seen her actually take any action to do that. Her words and actions don't line up. If you're so reluctant to actually have Cinder hunt down RWBY and would rather keep her relegated to attacking maidens, then just don't have her bring up her hatred for RWBY all the time. Don't tell the audience one thing, but then show them something else. So yeah, if RT is going to dedicate so much more effort into having not Team RWBY participating in the story, we shouldn't be spending so much time on Team RWBY. Either drop the RWBY is our main character's facade and actually let us watch the characters who are important to keeping the story going, or put in the effort to have Team RWBY earn the distinction of being considered our main characters. You don't want Nora to be the one to talk to Robin? You'd rather that be something Blake and Yang do? Then just make Yang be the one who cares about Mantle instead of Nora. You don't need to dedicate 6 episodes to setting up a side character's arc. Spend that time on your protagonists instead. Nora can still get to play, but shouldn't be taking the bulk of our screen time. If you're gonna have the finale of the volume revolve around Penny and Winter fending off Cinder, let our protagonists participate too. The maiden plots constantly alienate our main characters to instead force other girl McGees into the spotlight. Make our heroes care. Weiss knows about Freya, she should be there too, helping her sister and Penny, but instead they simply let Weiss know about the central conflict ahead of time, just to have her dick around with the characterless extras. Simply allowing Team RWBY to be involved with the main conflicts would actually help them be worth our time. As it is, it's just the girls talking about the villains a lot, not knowing anything about them, and then not trying to engage with the villains when they show up. Our title team is always relegated to fighting lackeys or extras. Why not let them participate in the main battles? Instead of having Team RWBY do nothing important fighting the Grimm, and then do nothing important fighting the Aesops, let them involve themselves with the real bad guys. I like the gravity fight, but by all means, RWBY should have been there too. RWBY has only ever gotten into combat with one member of Team Witch, and even then, Crow took over the fight and did all the work. Let RWBY interact with our main villains. Any excuse can be made to have RWBY run off to help Ironwood. It's not like this would be the first time she abandoned her team to fight a baddie, and doing this would be wholly beneficial to our main character. She'd get to engage in another central villain, she'd get to make an impact on the baddies by doing more than just having her Deus Ex Machina turn on. It'd allow her a glimpse at seeing Ironwood's power and ruthlessness before his shift into anti-hero. Just let RWBY engage with the main plot for once. So, I guess as a way to round off this video, let's do a small breakdown on how Rooster Teeth could have involved Team RWBY more in the plot. First of all, have Yang be the one who advocates for Mantle instead of Nora. Let Nora agree by all means, but have Yang be the vocal one of the group. That way the truck scene feels earned. Team RWBY can entrust the lamp to Oscar, who sticks with Ironwood to try and figure out how to keep the relic safe. But like, have the girls talk to Oscar more throughout the volume? In general, they don't interact enough. Why wasn't he invited to the license party? But moreover, they can keep each other caught up on what's going on with James and Mantle respectively. Weiss talking with Winter about Freya was good. Keep that in. Have RWBY's talks with Penny revolve more around how they feel about Ironwood's plans, especially once he starts making more questionable decisions. Also, have RWBY try to do something during Tyrion's attack. She doesn't have to succeed, but she should do more than just sit on her ass for the encounter. Once Watts turns off the heat, have it only be Yang and Blake do the running around Mantle with the Aesops. They're still trying to help the people, and less characters on the ground would allow us to have more time getting to care about the Aesops. During that time, RWBY and Weiss can head off to find Winter and Penny. Once the girls learn that Ironwood's heading to the arena though, RWBY splinters off to help him, while Weiss stays to assist her sister. While Weiss and the others begin to be accosted by Cinder, RWBY fights Watts with Ironwood. I think it'd be nice to have Watts win against her, showing us that he actually is a threat and that she still has to grow. This would also allow Ironwood to keep his brutal victory against Watts. He and RWBY then return to his office to find Cinder's glass. He initiates martial law, and RWBY runs off to try and find her friends. Ironwood sends out Team RWBY's arrest warrant. Blake and Yang, still in Mantle, fend off the Aesops, who are now attempting to arrest the girls amidst the Grimm attack. Rather than properly fighting back, Blake and Yang run from the Aesops to find Maria and Pietro, which means the Aesops aren't so easily beaten despite being the strongest huntsman in Atlas. Penny and Winter also learn of how Weiss should be arrested, but the group are too busy dealing with Cinder and Freya to take action. Also, Penny cares about Team RWBY and doesn't really agree with Ironwood's actions, and we get to see how, despite remaining loyal to Ironwood, Winter's still willing to bend the rules for the sake of her family. The group all have their tussle around the maiden stuff, which would now also include Weiss prompting Penny to do what she thinks is right, leading to Penny becoming the maiden. The Schnees get real hurt by Cinder, but luckily RWBY shows up. Seeing her friend in danger prompts her eyes to activate. Still a Deus Ex Machina, but it's better than them just turning on the second RWBY sees Cinder. And from there it's the same. Blake and Yang show up in the airship with the Elders to pick up RWBY, Weiss, and Penny. Winter, hurt by not getting the maiden powers, calls for backup for Weiss's arrest. James shoots the farm boy, Neo gets the lamp. All the stuff with Crow and Clover basically doesn't have to change to let Team RWBY be involved with the main plot. And like, honestly, this wasn't hard to do. Just let our main characters be there for the important moments. It isn't enough to simply tell us the girls are our protagonists. The team has to earn that distinction. Goku is our protagonist because he's the only one strong enough to save the day, most of the time. The Elric brothers are our protagonists because they play a central role in Father's plan and are the most active members of the cast trying to stop him. Spike is our protagonist because he has unfinished business with Vicious and Julia. Team RWBY are our protagonists because The trailers said so. I want to care about Team RWBY, and clearly the show expects me to as well, but after 5 years of our title team playing backseat roles for the plot, I find it really hard to do that anymore. Either stop pretending Team RWBY is worth our time and actually focus on the characters who really matter to the plot, or make Team RWBY worth our time and have them matter to the plot. You can't have it both ways. You can't tell us Team RWBY are the main characters while never using them for the main story. It's time for Rooster Teeth to really figure out who they want to be the protagonists of this show. We can't keep doing this thing where we're expected to care about 11 different characters equally. We can't keep doing this thing where 11 different characters are all expected to get equal screen time. We can't keep doing this thing where 11 different characters are all playing the role of main character, because if we keep trying to do this, it just ends up hurting the development of our actual main characters. If we, the audience, are meant to care about Team RWBY and how they handle this story they're in, then it's time for the crew making this show to start caring about Team RWBY. It's their story. Let them actually be in it. Hey, I just wanted to pop in to mention that we have some new goodies available on our Patreon, so don't be afraid to check that out in the link below.